Thanks very much indeed. And I'm delighted that I will have to bring you from the future to the present. But from the future to the present with, I hope, a new lens on the logic that if you can see the present better, hence the new lens, then perhaps that gives you that ability to create into the future that you mentioned. So here it's about the bridge between the economy, which isn't doing too well, and ecology, which is doing even worse, and the rationale as to why we need that bridge, which is in fact the lens that I'm talking about. Let me begin with a picture that some of you may recognize as the Amazonian rainforest. I think most of you know that it's an amazing store of biodiversity and an amazing store of carbon, but what isn't often talked about because of our problem with lenses is that, in fact, this is also an amazing rainfall factory. And an estimated 20 billion tons of water vapor evaporates from the Amazonian rainforest every day. The northeastern trade winds go over the Amazon rainforest, pick up this moisture, and they condense it over Mato Grosso and the plains of Argentina and Uruguay and Paraguay. And that's why that region is the granary of Latin America. Most of that rainfall is originated in the state of Amazonas in Brazil. So the question occurs to one that, well, there's a $240 billion per annum agricultural economy out there. How much does Mato Grosso, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina actually pay the governor of Amazonas for their share in providing the single most important resource input into that economy, which is water? And the answer, as you've guessed, is precisely zero. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an example of what I call the economic invisibility of nature. That rainfall cycle is an ecosystem service, as we call it. That ecosystem service is a public good. Nobody can tell the clouds where to rain. At the same time, you can't destroy the rainforest because there's no money flowing for the conservation of that forest. That's part of the problem. We use nature, of course we do. This granary would not exist. We use nature because she's valuable. We lose nature because she's free. But this isn't just a problem with rainforests or with Brazil or with agriculture. This is a problem also with society. Because here's what this means. If we look beyond GDP statistics, and I like the phrase the gross damage to the poor, because that's really what the whole issue is about. If we look at these missing ecosystem services, nutrients, freshwater flows, stuff that is received by society but is not accounted for in our economic systems and in our GDP, you typically get answers like 10, 16, 20, 21% as the missing services that are not accounted in GDP. But if you look exactly at who is missing those services, the answer comes to you that, well, it's actually the poor farmer, because it's the poor farmer's crops that are destroyed in the absence of microclimate regulation. It's the poor farmer's cattle and goats that can't go into the forest for leaf litter, and it's the poor farmer's wife who cannot get the fuel wood to cook, and that's, by the way, 60% of humanity. So the challenge here is not to think of nature and its invisible flows as small percentages of GDP, which we can worry about, but not much. But think of them in terms of the missing components of the GDP of the poor. Nature's treasury is not merely a luxury for the rich, it's a necessity for the poor. It provides, depending on where you are, and the examples that my colleagues from the TEEB project and I worked out, depending on where you are, it could be 50, 75, even 90% of your household incomes, and that's the challenge. When we talk development, and at the same time we ignore nature on some kind of logic that, there's a trade-off between development and looking after the natural environment, that's nothing but a misunderstanding coming from a broken lens. That broken lens of GDP and that broken lens of private profits is really what's causing that misunderstanding. And we are not seeing the connection between poverty and the natural environment. We are not seeing that nature is not merely incidental, but central to the survival of the poor. What does the private sector have to do with it? Indeed, what do bankers like us, and I count myself as an ex-banker, having spent 17 years at Deutsche and before that 12 years at ANZ, largely in markets. What do we have to do with any of this, or our companies, or our portfolio investees? Well, the answer is this: because a lot of the losses that we are seeing in nature, a lot of the degradation and the loss of ecosystems and biodiversity is actually being driven by, once again, a problem with the lens. And the lens here I talk about is the lens of private profits. I take an example from South Thailand of shrimp farming to explain what this is about. 1 hectare of land, of mangroves converted into a shrimp farm, presents a net present value, a positive net present value of $9,600. Why? Because shrimp farming is valuable. This is the present value of that's produced. And against that, you have a cost. Well, you've lost the mangroves, so you've lost the supply of fuel wood for the local community. Well, that's about $580. Good. Let's convert all mangrove forests into shrimp farms because it makes sense economically. That's the lens of private profits. But just a moment. What about subsidies? Oops. Okay, yes. So then you discover that actually South Thailand, the government provides $8,000 of subsidies, so therefore the comparison isn't looking all that hot. And then you start thinking, what about the public assets? What about the costs of restoring the shrimp farm land back to productivity after 5-6 years when salt deposition and chemical deposition has destroyed its capacity to serve any useful purpose? And what about the benefits of the mangroves protecting coastlines against damage from storms and cyclones as they increase in intensity when time comes and climate changes? And those are huge benefits, upwards of $12,000. And the costs of restoration are huge costs, upwards of $11,000. So now we are not talking of comparing plus $9,600 versus $580. We're actually talking about exactly the opposite. Plus $12,000 versus minus $11,000. What has changed? The lens has changed. We are now suddenly thinking in terms of the total benefit to society as a result of that conversion of land, the land use change, and not merely the private profit driver. Okay, point taken. South Thailand has a problem. Why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because it's not just South Thailand, it's the entire world. And here's some studies that have been done by a group called TrueCost, which looked at the impacts, the negative externalities, the cost to third parties of doing business as usual, of the top 3,000 listed companies. And that answer, ladies and gentlemen, is a staggering $2.15 trillion. These externalities are in the form of carbon emissions, in the form of private extraction of fresh water, waste, and the cost of health to that, pollution, etc., etc. Nothing illegal. These are just the cost to society of doing business as usual by the top 3,000 companies, and they add up to a princely 3.5% of global GDP. It's not small. It's not just about South Thailand. It's about the whole world, and it's about our role as financiers who effectively are encouraging and supporting the system because we don't have yet the filters to recognize negative externalities or indeed to make investment decisions or lending decisions against them. But the good news is that the usual excuses are over. The usual excuses would be, God, this is too difficult, of course, we understand this, but who on earth is going to give us the numbers? Where are the numbers? Well, finally, the numbers are beginning to come through. My project team on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, a G8+5 project, which published last year, did a few example calculations, and one which it did was particularly interesting and apparently complex, which is with China, and the impacts of forest destruction in China on the economy. And we worked out these impacts, and they were in the nature of loss of precipitation, the cost of floods and damage, and so on, agricultural losses. This was real because in 1997, the Yellow River went dry. For 9 months of the year, there was no water. A year later, the Yangtze flooded. 5,500 people died. So these are the sort of real impacts that were happening there, and these can be quantified. And were the costs of all these externalities, as they call them, accounted for properly, then we would have had the price of timber in China at 2.5 times what it actually was. And the beneficiaries of this mispricing was, of course, the countries to which timber was exported in the form of prefab materials, which means Japan, Europe, USA, Korea, and Hong Kong, by the way. And who were the losers? Well, the people of China who suffered the consequences of the losses from nature. These externalities can be measured, and Puma has actually taken forward the work that we did in the TEEP project and done a full value chain analysis. Its driver was, of course, partly just good performance and good responsibility. And Jochen Seitz, the chairman of Puma, had another driver, which is to understand his company's footprint on water, because to him, they were using rubber grown, which is subject to water crises. They were using leather tanneries and polluting water, and of course they use cotton for t-shirts, which is highly water using. So for a company of $3 billion turnover and $250 million profits, to not realize that it has a significant water dependence and externalities of the order of 145 million euros, that's $200 million, that to him was unsatisfactory. And therefore he pushed his company to work out these numbers, to work out their footprint. An interesting result, most of this footprint, 75%, is in what is called Tier 3 and Tier 4 of the supply chain. Basically the growers of rubber and wood, rubber and cotton, and Tier 3 is basically the converters of that raw material into usable product. To manage footprint, you need to manage the supply chain. But that's the sense that one has obtained from calculations such as these, is that we do need to look at the supply chain, and that's where the small and medium enterprises come in. Most of the supply chain, the growers of whatever product, tend to be farmers, and it brings my discourse back to farmers and farms. I'll break into that point by saying this is based on the statistical evaluation of what's a green economy done by some colleagues at the United Nations Environment Programme and I a couple of years back. And our conclusions were that if we took 1/10 of global investment and invested it towards green economy, which means energy efficiency, resource efficiency, sustainable forestry and fisheries, sustainable agriculture, and so on, then we would actually see an economy in which not only would you get much lower ecological footprint, in fact, halving it, but also you would get reduced use of fresh water and energy, which is something that we do want to move towards. And one of the key conclusions we reached was that the results were quite apparent, that yes, a green economy is a better economic model than our current brown economy. But equally, we found a number of interesting examples of where it succeeded. You often hear the argument about renewable energy and solar PV being not possible, but microfinance in Bangladesh has made it possible. Microfinance solar panels enabled housewives effectively to run small electricity companies in their neighborhood by wiring up their solar panel, which you see out there, it's not very big, 4 foot by 2, wiring them up to their neighbors so that they sell the surplus to their neighbors at the same price as the cost of kerosene that the neighbors would save. In other words, you are saving the health costs of kerosene lamps to women and children. At the same time, you're using renewable energy. It's a bankable model because money is being paid for the renting of electricity. 400,000 homes in Bangladesh today are electrified in solar panels. This is a poor country. They are purchased from Japan. These are not cheap panels. But they work because of microfinance and because of the fact that there are no subsidies on kerosene in Bangladesh. They've never had the fiscal space. The Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India told me when I narrated this to him that, well, actually we never had the fiscal capacity either, but we still went ahead and subsidized kerosene 80%. So there's a lesson to be learned there, that sometimes the wrong things can result in the wrong results. But there is one area of potential use of microfinance, and that brings me to agriculture, which is, in my opinion, the hugest development opportunity. And this is about sustainable agriculture. 2.5 billion people depend on agricultural production for their livelihood. There are 525 million farms around the world. 400 million of them are less than 2 hectares, ladies and gentlemen, just 2 hectares. Those are subsistence farms, farms where food is grown for the family and the farmer and for the local market. And it is possible by using sustainable farming methods to increase the yield in these farms by as much as 79% on average. That was a study done across 12 million farms, across 280 projects in 57 developing countries by Judith Pretty and other scientists. Reinforced by an even more staggering answer by an FAO study done a few years later. What does this mean for us? It means that if we target small farms and the yield on small farms, then finally we have the right discourse on agriculture, because it's about solving the food problem and solving the poverty problem. More income in the hands of the poor, 80% more yield means that much more capacity to earn income, means solving the income problem for the poor, and there are 1.3 odd billion people who depend on them. And of course, if you're producing that much more food, then you've done a significant contribution towards food supply when we keep worrying about how do we feed 9 billion people in 2050. We can, of course, feed them now because of the amount of waste that we undertake in the food chain. But the beauty of this point is that this is where the discourse should head on farming. And this is where development banking should be looking at. It's not about should it be sustainable versus non-sustainable, or should it be organic versus non-organic, or should it be GM crops versus non-GM crops. But should it be keep the small farm and add yield and price capacity, or convert it into intensive farming and then end up with an unemployment problem because you can't employ 1.3 billion people around the world in industrialized models for development. There is no capacity in the world to purchase 1 billion Ferraris for the sake of argument. You just can't use an industrial development model to solve poverty. That was the point about increasing yield, but also there's an issue of price. And a small example of how success can work. Low-cost storage, nearly $20 or $100 for storage bins for families and communities can be used. And these have worked in countries as complex and difficult as Afghanistan. And the Bolivian example that I give here is remarkable because the price of maize was almost triple using this storage as against not using the storage. The microfinance that would be needed here, it wasn't microfinance as it happened, it was provided by the FAO. But the microfinance needed here would be literally $20 or $100 per family. So, ladies and gentlemen, yet another opportunity at the microfinance end. And finally, we have so much to look at in natural capital. It's not just about forests, it's not just about agricultural yield, but it's even about climate change adaptation. Rebuilding ecosystems and creating employment to rebuild ecosystems is a way of adding resilience, whether it is improving storm and flood protection thanks to forest restoration, or whether it is restoring fish nurseries by replanting mangrove forests, or whether it is increasing fish stocks by improving wetlands or coral reefs. These are opportunities to invest in natural capital, which generate, as with any investment opportunity, employment and returns. The reason they don't happen is, once again, the problem of our lens. We are constantly stuck with this lens of private profits. We are constantly at battle with the idea that we should be working towards public benefit and public wealth. But thankfully, we are here at FMO, at an investment bank, which is not at a bank, which is a development bank, and not merely looking at optimizing private profits. So one hopes that the likes of FMO and other development banks can see the opportunity here and also can see the outcomes of investing in natural capital. If we go back to return statistics, these have been calculated. The kind of costs have been worked out for these sorts of restorations, and the benefit-cost ratios are staggeringly good. You have ratios of as much as 12 to 27 times in the case of grasslands, and the lowest of the benefit-cost ratios is for coral reefs because it's expensive to restore them. Internal rates of return of 17, 20, 40% usually can give strong promotions, if not bonuses, to some development bankers. And here's an example where we have those returns available, but hardly any dollar is invested because, once again, it's the issue of who should invest, who should organize this, who should pay for it. Well, basically this is about public wealth. It is the public investment that should be made. But the organizers of this investment, the originators, should be us, development banks and bankers. Thanks very much indeed. I end there. Thank you.